everybody to the Fully Remote Talk Show. This is the talk show for leaders adapting their style for a fully remote world. We are talking again today about one of our favorite topics, which is meetings. If we did like a free word association with the word meetings at any point of time, I would notice that like people would associate the word meeting with something negative, especially like our remote first audience, like, meeting fatigue or boring meetings or like unnecessary meetings or like too many meetings is kind of what we would always think about meetings. And this has become the pattern. Like meetings has become the thing that we love to hate in the corporate world right now. So meetings should not be this. I think meetings are like an indispensable part of an organization. And it's important for us that when we're bringing these minds together of all these people, how do we make it so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? How do we drive outcomes, align people, make it productive, make it inspirational? How can we do this? And the answer to this lies in designing your meetings. And what is designing a meeting? What does design have to do with meetings? We're going to talk about that today. And to talk about that, we have our special guest, Kevin. Kevin, welcome to our show. Super excited to have you over here. For those of you who don't know Kevin, Kevin is an author, specifically wrote the book called Meeting Design, and we will talk about that today. And he has spent a lot of time in the world of design, probably about like 30 years now, and has wealth of information in taking meetings from being this thing that most people hate to like being productive, and how can organizations move across that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Kevin, again, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again, Arjun.
This is awesome. Yes, I'm going to jump into a sort of a cozy setup for us to chat over here.
Okay.
um, Okay. So I'm going to start off with asking you more about the book. I mean, tell us about Meeting Design book. What prompted you to write that?
Uh, I I think the first time I thought about exploring this topic as something I wanted to build my own abilities in was when I was working at an agency in Philadelphia. Um, my boss at the time, he really um, was frustrated with the relationship between the kind of kickoff meetings we were having for our clients and the outcomes we were getting from those meetings. We really depended on those kinds of meetings to establish alignment and to build momentum and to accomplish other business goals and really client goals as well. And uh, he tasked me with trying to solve that problem. So I dove into some research and learned about a lot of background literature there is in facilitation. And as a designer or as somebody who worked in user experience design, I just the connection occurred to me that the meetings were an experience that we could be intentional about, and that a lot of the intentionality, um, I think, had just evolved away from meetings. Um, and a lot of the literature around meetings and facilitation was great. A lot of literature I found, and I think a lot of the really formative literature really predates the capabilities of the technology these days. And this was
Mhm.
before Zoom and
Right.
before companies like yours. Like this was in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, and around the 2000s. We were still doing a lot of things via phone.
Mm.
We would share slides remotely and walk through slides, but we weren't talking to each other like you and I are talking right now, certainly in a digital way. So it was always interesting to me, those three things. Like, number one, we're not being intentional with the time and
Right.
trying to align it to a particular outcome. Number two, facilitation as a practice or other kind of skill sets around meetings going well was kind of an area of literature that there was a lot of good stuff in, but it wasn't really modernized. And number three, like I think the way we work has really evolved, especially in the last 15 years. So over a long period of time, I kind of ran experiments and shared my ideas as I ran them in various articles, and that kind of turned into a book eventually.
Awesome. This is great. You brought up a good point about like how obviously you wrote the book pre-COVID era, and I think even like when you were talking about all these early 2000s, mid 2000s, like meetings by default were thought of to be in mostly in a conference room where people come together. If you were to like put like a clip out of it, that's kind of how people thought about meetings. But it's kind of shifted. Like now meetings by default are like thought of as like hybrid with people across that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious to know, like, um, in this last few years, have you thought about things that you would add to that book, or like what else would you change to that book, or do you think some of the fundamental principles that was discussed over there still remain the same, while there might be some things to add?
Yeah, definitely the latter. I think that the fundamental principles of collaboration as a designed experience
Right.
are not really any different uh, than they were before the pandemic, and certainly before technologies that allowed us to do this remotely. I think that if anything, the constraints are different.
Hmm.
So, like the goal of you and I coming together with the intention of exploring a topic in this context of you and I having a real time meeting, and the topics that you want to hit on, and some of your thoughts about those topics, and what you want to explore, that's your intention. If we were to do that in a studio, like a talk show studio, and we were in person, our ability to recognize and pick up on social cues would be much better than they are here. So I really I think remote collaboration and remote meetings are both kind of their different set of constraints. And there are things that you can do that the software, I think, is starting to catch up. It was really interesting to me. I think there was a long period of time before whiteboarding tools or remote collaboration tools where people were using cloud-based tools to run meetings, but that's not
Mhm.
what the tools were designed for. So like the really basic example is like we all have the same Google document open and we're all typing in it at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's a real good facilitation technique. It's called capture. Like we did it I wasn't in any meetings in the 1970s because I was less than 10 years old, but this was the thing that was defined in the 1970s. It's like, you know what, if we all wrote what we were saying and we all wrote it and looked at it the same way, like we all contributed to it, that we would have a different experience and create a feedback loop between our mouths and our brains, and we would process information differently. And the technology, like Google Docs, allowed us to do that, but it wasn't designed to do that. It wasn't like people made Google Docs. I think the people that designed things like Google Docs and Microsoft 365, they were thinking about very asynchronous types of collaboration. Like I can edit a thing and then somebody else can pop in and edit a thing, and we'll
Right.
maintain a history of what the thing is, but not as a tool for augmenting conversation. And now the whole the augmented conversation tool space is a very competitive and a very lucrative space. I know that lots of companies have really done well in the during the quarantine in terms of getting really good funding and investment and growing that, because I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but there doesn't seem to be a future where psychologically, for me, I can't think of a future where psychologically I want to be in an office for 40 hours a week. Just, I can't conceive of that. I've worked that way for years, for a long time before before the quarantine, for almost 10 years, I was working either partially or fully remote, but I was an anomaly in my field, and there were a lot of really competitive, desirable jobs in design that required you to move. I took one of them at one point. Um, so
Right.
I think now for me, and I think for a lot of people, the idea of thinking about work as physically bound is just really odd. It feels
Yeah.
odd to me.
No, that's a great point. And no, you mentioned a few things. I want to put a pin on those around like sort of the intentionality of design as well as the uh, you know augmenting tools and like how to like make take advantage of the virtual medium. I
Mhm.
want to definitely put a pin on that. But to the last point that you talked about, like when we spoke earlier on, you mentioned this idea of like defaulting to virtual. Like, tell me a little bit more about that and like what you mean by that.
Yeah, in the book I talk about this, and I think this, in light of the distributed workforce being what it is in the quarantine, it's different, but the point is the same, and that is, when I in a previous job I was in a multi-geographic large company. We had offices in multiple cities. We would often do what people call hybrid meetings,
Right.
where there are groups of people in different locations. And if you didn't default the design of that experience for virtual,
Mm,
it was a fundamentally reduced experience
mm,
for everyone. It's kind of like, in the accessibility community, and inclusive design. The the idea is not to adapt a designed thing to be more inclusive of people who may not have the same capabilities or the same technology abilities, or the same physical abilities, or like I think a lot of accessibility consulting or software is built around the concept of remediation,
right.
where it's like, we have a thing, we have a website, whatever, and we need to fix it so that someone who can't see can also use it. But
Mm,
if you design it so that anyone can use it from the ground up,
mm,
then you're fundamentally designing a different thing. The point of this is the analogous thing with meetings is that if you design them so that your geographic location isn't a constraint,
mm,
you're fundamentally including everyone that might get value from that conversation. Whereas, like, if you design the meeting so that there are inside conversations that are based on you being in the physically in the same space, you're actually eliminating opportunities to grow and to share ideas, and to hit on the thing that might solve the problem you're trying to solve.
love it. Yeah. Sort of jumping into more about like the intentionality in design that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. There are like many different components associated with the meeting, right? Like everything from like who attends to what content, everything as well. Just tell me about like when somebody has to be intentional about like design of a meeting.
Hmm.
What are the things that they should be thinking about?
So, like, I think often people think about design. There's a designer, Jared Spool, who talks about design as the rendering of intention.
Mm,
So, if you look at a website or mobile application and you're thinking about the design of that thing, it's a combination of different people's intentions. It's the
mm,
intention of the designer, it's the intention of the business, it's the intention of the user, all combined. And sometimes the design choices that you make, like, what do you present to them first, how do you orient them to things they're unfamiliar with, how do you educate them about information that applies to their choices, how do you walk them through a choice in an experience. It's all different intentions, and there are things like dark patterns where the
mm,
business will use the business's intentions to lead the user to agree to something they might not quite understand, or worse.
right.
So if you think about the intention of a meeting at a very basic level, you could argue that the intention of any meeting is to make decisions.
Mm,
And Google Ventures has some old uh, coaching on meetings where they say, the first thing you should do is say, what decisions are you trying to make? And if you aren't going to
mm,
make any decisions, you shouldn't have a meeting. And I don't really disagree with that. I think that's reasonable. Um, that's a reasonable way of looking at it. I think it's a lot harder to, to identify what the decisions are. And I think a lot of times when we have meetings, we're in the process of identifying what the problems are, what the boundaries of the problems are, before we even get to what decisions we need to make, or there are decisions we haven't even thought about. And we use conversations to get to some of those things, and that's fine, and that's very human and very, very like, we're not fully rational. Sometimes we're barely rational. Like, we're very emotional and rational beings. So intentionality in a meeting comes back to, well, what you could say, decisions are you trying to make, or what, another way to put it that I like is, what will be different in the world after this meeting
Right.
that wasn't that way before. It could be we all say the same thing. We all mean the same thing when we say the same thing. It could be that we all agree that A is more important than B. It could be that we've decided on a budget. It could be whatever. But before the meeting, thinking about, okay, what's going to be different? And then in every aspect of the meeting, making decisions that align to that outcome. So in terms of content, is the content going to help us get to that outcome? In terms of interactivity, is a conversation the right tool at this time in the agenda, Q&A or open discussion or whatever you call it? Is that going to get us to the outcome, or is it going to open up a bunch of other things that maybe aren't aligned to our outcome, but that could be important? Is the people that I've selected to attend, have I selected the people based on the outcome that I want, or other reasons? And are you aware of those reasons? I work in government now, and in government, a lot of the times, the logic of selection of attendees is almost more based on coverage and I don't want to say fear. Sometimes it is fear, but it's based on this question of, am I going to get discovered that I didn't include the right person? So by default, I'll over invite, and then and that's not really, well, that is outcome based thinking, and that the outcome that you're looking for is safety.
Right.
So I don't know that that's a thing that you want to be different in the world. I want to feel, I think everybody wants to feel more safe, but it isn't an outcome that helps an organization achieve a mission. Culturally it is, but not in a meeting.
No, I think I love that point that you make about the sort of the outcome, or the decision, or the purpose of that meeting is what will drive these other components, including the content, the attendees, the interactivity. The design is basically all leading towards that purpose, or reason of running this meeting. And I think one of the things that, as a leader, right, if I'm sort of setting up this remote first culture right now for my organization, is the leader the one who is mostly responsible for this happening for all the meetings? And whose responsibility is it? This is happening at every meeting level, or is there something that an organization as a whole should define this as a part of the culture? Where should that change come from?
I think it's an interesting question. I can't answer that in a way that would universally apply to all organizations.
Right.
I think that the journey of an organization, so whether your organization is your team, like the nuclear family that you work with every day, your 2 pizza box team, your agile team, or your organization is like your multi tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in a giant company, wherever that organization is in its journey to looking at itself, will answer the question of how it approaches. It'll answer the question, number one, is it a problem? What is the delta between how productive we believe our meetings are and how productive they actually are for the people that depend on them? And then if the organization is willing to do that self-examination, what are the mechanisms for achieving that? So, getting back to your actual question, I think there are some organizations where the culture of the organization and the things that motivate people to act require more top-down standards and policies. You know, and certainly the boss saying this is how we do things and you must do this and there are consequences if you don't, helps. But I also think, like, you know, on some level, what you're talking about is change management, which is to say, we have a big group of people and we have a mission, and our mission is to make widgets. And maybe it's a positive mission, like those widgets are helping the world, or maybe it's a profitable mission, like those widgets are things that we make money on. But if you don't have an organization where the organization hasn't had some agency in defining behaviors that are to the benefit of the organization, those behaviors, the behavior change that you're trying to create isn't going to stick.
Right.
And so I think, like, you know, in a classic non-answer, top down and bottom up are both necessary. And what the mix is of top down policy and bottom up behavior change or behavior modeling is going to depend on the culture you have at the time and where you want to go. One of the things I really like to do when I talk to companies or teams about this as a challenge is apply agile methodology to the problem.
Right.
So agile methodology, or the scientific method, is change something and see if you get the resultant result you want. And if you do more of it, and if you don't, do less of it. So, like, I've consulted with agencies and companies that want to change their meeting culture, and sometimes they really want, like, give us a playbook that will change everything. And I'm like, you can make that. We could make it together in a workshop. We could make a playbook that we think will work for your culture. But I would actually say the first thing you should do is change one thing. Change like one thing, like make it a requirement that at the beginning of every meeting, the person who called the meeting says, the reason we're here is to do this today. We're not going to leave until it's done. And then see how often that happens. Run a random sample of meetings, or have somebody be like a secret meeting attender who attends meetings and sees if that's happening. And if it's happening, report on it, and ideally report on the experience of those meetings, some measure of how productive people feel those meetings were, or how satisfied they are. And if you can say from a data standpoint, meetings where people did blank, whether it's declare the purpose at the beginning, or only invited attendees that could affect the decision, or had a visual representation of the agenda that we followed in a Google Doc or a board of some kind or whatever. Like, if you could say that those meetings achieve their result twice as much as meetings that didn't have that, or people who attended those meetings were much happier with their time, use of their time. Or, you know, like, there's any number of ways to do this, but it's all basically the scientific method. It's like make small changes and assess. And that assessment, I think, is, for better or worse, we've kind of pre-pandemic gotten into a lot of meeting defaults. And certainly with the agile transformation of the industry, of the software industry anyway, and lots of other industries, there are still a lot of meeting defaults. Like, we do retros, we do stand-ups, we do inceptions or grooming sessions or whatever. And those are all, there's a lot of autopilot or a lot of ceremony. And to me, ceremony is very much the abdication of intention. Like, you know, I don't have any strong opinions about religion. But I do think that historically, if you look at organized religion and a lot of the ceremony around organized religion, and if you were to relate that to a measure of, like, actual spirituality, it would be really interesting. Like, are people more spiritual as a result of these kind of repetitive ceremonies. Like, this is when I stand up, and this is when I sit down, and this is when I read this thing. And like, and the thing that kills me about Agile, that I find both amusing and a little bit discouraging, is that a lot of big companies and small teams, their approach to Agile is very ceremony based. It's very surface.
Right.
And those meetings become rituals. And like, in the 15 years or so that I've been talking about and writing about meetings, well, maybe 10 years, let's say 10 years. What year is it? No, about 15 years. Close to 15 years. The one thing that I've heard, like, there are a couple of questions I hear all of the time. One of them is, our stand-ups are terrible. Why is that?
Right.
It's like, it's probably because you're just having stand-ups and you're not actually thinking about the point. Like, if you're just getting together and you have a script, and the script says, this is when I talk and this is when I don't talk, you might as well just do a play. Like, just put on a play and never change the script, and you'll get the same result. But if you say, if the purpose of our stand-ups is to eliminate rework, and you measure rework, you're like, rework is when somebody starts working on something that's already underway. And how many times does that happen? And then we need to change the way we do our stand-ups to reduce that. Like, that to me is an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I really love this. I mean, it almost seems like, first that when you started saying this, that there is no sort of a golden script or like anything that you can take it. I was like, it's like, oh, I wish we had something like that. But then, like, I think I kind of get it. Like, I mean, the idea of, even when you do go and come up with, like, this is a best practice, this is the guide to doing it, it has to be evolving. It has to be something that, like, people are going to have to, like, do small experiments to, like, see where it shifts and, like, make it work for them, and do it in a way that makes it's like kind of data driven, and not like obviously because somebody's saying that you have to do it. I love that. And to the point where these ceremonies or like these processes become so like set in stone, to the point where, like, now your job is to follow the ceremonies, less about being intentional about it. And I love that point. I think that's it's a great way of framing that. And you touched upon one very important point around, like, sort of these behavior changes, especially when we're talking about, like, how people do this. I want to talk about this in, like, two levels over here, right? Like, first of all, like, we are asking people to change behavior, and you mentioned really nicely that, like, take a small behavior change, one small thing at a time, because that's more easy to do that part of it. The first part being behavior change of the person organizing the meeting, to do that, to make it a little bit better. But then there is also this other concept of behavior change around, like, you setting this purpose is going to cause other people to change their behaviors in the meeting. Like, maybe they're going to, like, be more energetic, be more focused, or be more open to discussion, or whatever that behavior change that you desire is to bring about in that. Tell me more about that. And because behavior change is probably one of the most hardest things, and design is one of the ways in which you can actually, like, make behavior change a lot more easy. So how can, like, I mean, the question being that, like, uh, how can you design a meeting so you can can design help with, like, the desired behavior change, and how can it do that?
Yeah, I think so. There's so many places to start. The question, I think you have to start with context. So, like any good design, you need to do some discovery and understand. Oh, I have a guest. I'm sorry, my dog is walking behind me. You have to do some discovery, and you have to kind of define a context. And then I think once you've got context, you need to commit to ideally a very transparent experimentation effort. So it's like, we're going to do this first, and we're going to report on the results, and we're going to be accountable for telling you what happened and when it happened. And I would say, in the consulting work that I do, and I don't do that much consulting these days as I used to, but in the consulting work I've done, often that's a hard sell. Like organizations don't think of meetings as a thing they don't already do because they do it so much. Even organizations that were previously remote, they don't think of meetings as a thing that they don't know how to do because they do them all the time. Like, trying to think of a good metaphor. So, like, it can be a hard sell culturally if there's something you do every day. I feel like there's a lot of disruptive examples. Like I brush my teeth twice a day, every day, with a regular toothbrush, like a manual toothbrush. And then, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, you started to see electric toothbrushes be kind of common. And those electric toothbrushes were based on the toothbrushes that are in dentists' offices. Like, they're based on the kind of implements and automated tools that are in dentist offices, but the technology allowed it to be price effective to put it in the home. They were kind of expensive at first, but now you can go to Target and you can get one for $10. And that disruption, it was a combination of people getting results, but also leadership. And in my metaphor, I guess that would be dentists. Like the companies like Philips probably developing relationships with dental offices and saying, hey, we want you to promote our thing. And also really just, I hate to say it, but some degree of branding design and thinking about it. So the question of changing collaboration, changing the way we talk to each other in a business context, I think is now it's the quarantine and distributed workforces have kind of been a disrupting factor, a forcing factor. And then if you combine that with software that people have really awesome experiences, I'm a Mural user. Mural, I think, is a good example. But like Mural adds a layer of meaning that for people who, I almost think it adds like kind of a map for, depending on how you use it, it can add a map that is not dissimilar from like playing a video game, where I've played video games that are like open world and you have no idea what you're supposed to do first. And I've played video games where there's some intentionality to the design of the environment so that you can kind of intuit what you're supposed to do first. Like, that thing is a little bit brighter than other things, so I should go there. Or there's a little hidden arrow that if I go around a wall, there's some reason there's arrows pointing this direction that are part of the landscape, like signs. So subconsciously I turn that way, even though, there's nothing that told me to do that. Or there's a non-player character or whatever. But that kind of map, that kind of building maps that accommodate intentionality of an individual, but also collectively point them in some shared directions or create a shared experience. I think that that's a powerful behavior change tool. With visualization, which is, the Mural is based on the visualization collaboration and really designing collaboration. And I don't work for Mural. I use them, but Miro or Google Docs, it doesn't matter. Like, some visualization. I think the thing that's really important to remember is that you might understand it. Like, you might really understand, like, this is how we use the digital Post-it notes in Mural, and this is how we brainstorm an idea, and this is how we vote, and blah, 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 blah. But your organization is made of many people that are at different points in a spectrum of understanding that. And so creating behavior change is a gradual process. You want to have a meeting where everybody does one activity or one board or whatever, and then everybody's like, oh, we only want to work this way now. And sometimes you have that experience in your organization. I've had that experience where a team has been like, 100% changed by an experience like that. But more often than not, it's more of a, like, you have to crawl and then walk and then run. So being comfortable with behavior change taking time
Hmm.
and not being impatient. It kind of goes back to having a learning mindset, which
Right.
is like, if you have a very fixed mindset, you're like, I know this is a better way to work, so I'm just going to keep making people work this way. But if you have a learning mindset, you're like, this is a good way to work for me.
Hmm.
I want the best way to work for the people that are in this meeting right now. And I don't know what that is yet, but I'm going to create a menu or a collection of ways we could work together and see
Right.
what helps us get to the goal.
Right. I like that a lot. I think again goes back to a little bit of like being intentional about it and like designing. And I think you mentioned a few things that are really nice. Like, it's like having these sort of environmental cues that gives you direction as to like, hey, which is like, it's like there's a red arrow, like turn there. Like arrow is very obvious, but like there are certain things that will like subtly nudge you towards the right kind of
Yeah.
behavior and like using that kind of design. I mean, we are big thinkers on that spectrum, right? Like obviously, Zinc being a platform where we design experiences for different types of meetings, and
Mm-hmm.
you can like change everything from like the position. Now you're bigger and I'm smaller, like emphasis on you and me. This is cozy. There's like a nice thing. So we're using these kind of environmental cues to like be very intentional about like what kind of meeting this is, what kind of show this is, and everything. And so we think a lot about it. Kind of, I'd love to like know and your thoughts on like there is now a lot that we can do in this uh, virtual world, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
obviously we are at like probably like the first stage. We've just moved and graduated from this we are phone calls to a video calls to like now this is enhanced augmented working space over here. I mean, like I love to like say know your thoughts on like, hey, where is this going, or like what would you say is like the way that this is going to be trending? I know I'm like asking you to guess here, but what's your thoughts on that?
I don't know. And I definitely don't have a strong like vision for, I think it's going to be like this or this is going to be the next thing. I didn't buy stock in Zoom before. like like I'm sure like if you look at the stock chart of Zoom, it's crazy. Uh that being said, I think that, some people say context is king. So I
Mm,
think that like the pandemic or quarantine created a context,
mhm.
and that context was a both a unifying and a ubiquitous constraint.
Right.
It's like, this is how we're going to do stuff, and we're gonna like, once we psychologically get over the grief and the shock of what we're going through with the disease itself, we now are going to try to make a new normal.
Right.
I think that if you look at the trend, um, over a long period of time, like way pre-quarantine, there has been a trend towards visualization
Mm,
as a way of communication,
mm,
which is to say, away from the spoken dialogue as effective ways to communicate. We went from like boardroom style meetings to PowerPoint style presentations in the 80s
mhm.
ish, 1980s. And then in the 90s, we started to think about telephony and multiple locations. But again, visualization kept evolving. And I think now what we're seeing is kind of the a really interesting hybrid of what the technology allows us to simulate. Like
Mm,
right now, this is a simulation of you and I being in a room together talking, and what things couldn't exist in the physical world. Like there are things that you can visualize multidimensionally that just aren't really possible without some degree of trickery or some degree of
right.
digital special effects. So like I'm not a big VR or even an AR person, and I certainly don't have anything more than a passing understanding of the design involved in VR and AR. but I bet there's something
Mhm.
that will catch on eventually. I mean, certainly Meta as a concept and as a company thinks there is. I don't know if that's good or bad, but whatever. But I think there's something to one of a former colleague of mine who works for a company like that. Um, she she went to a big social media company specifically to deal with misinformation. She
Mhm.
was very motivated. She's like, I want to solve for misinformation, or at least that's what I believe she went to go there. That's my memory of what she said. She recently switched to augmented reality,
Mhm.
and there's probably something with regards to equitable experiences with augmented
Mhm.
reality. There's probably something with regards to um, visualization.
Here's what I found.
Thanks, Siri. There's probably something with regards to visualization and the possible
Mhm.
in meetings. Like so much of our meetings, to overgeneralize, so many of our meetings are describing things we don't have yet.
Right.
So it's like, we want to make this thing, whatever it is, and it's not there, but it's going to look like this, it's going to work like this, blah, blah, blah. There's probably visualization models and frameworks
Mhm.
beyond just the two-dimensional plane where we're thinking about a bunch of cards on a board, or we're thinking about lines and boxes or whatever.
Right.
There's probably some visualization fidelity and capabilities that will allow us to, in the real time of a conversation, get at that thing we don't have yet and experience it in a way. And honestly, I think that's one of the best things about the concept of co-design, of
Mhm.
actually bringing your users into the collaboration,
Right.
into the conversation about the thing. And if those two things came together, if co-design is a practice and making something real in real time in the digital space, if those two things collide in some product somewhere, I think that's a really interesting question. Um, it of course will require all the marketing and branding, and there needs to be some sort of application and business outcome. Like all of the things need to happen, but that's my answer to your question. Like
Right.
reducing the time to making a concept visualized to
Right.
nothing, and like, bringing the every perspective, especially the user perspective, into that conversation. I think that is a really powerful future, if it's possible or when it's
Nice.
possible.
I like it. I think I'm kind of AR and VR are like ways in which you can like sort of reduce the point of your ideas that are in words can be into like these tangible visual ways in which people can grasp your ideas better. That's powerful, and I think if we get to ever a stage where we can do that at runtime, like at while we are doing it, that's a whole new world.
Yeah.
Uh, Awesome. Kevin, this was great. I know that we've ran like a little bit over time over here, but like I appreciate
Okay.
you like staying and like giving us all this thought about designing a meeting to like predicting how
Sure.
things could go over here. Had a great conversation over here. I know we had one guest over here, Kendall. Thanks for joining the show. In case, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask? If it is, now is a good time to unmute and like probably raise hand and then like come up on stage and like either ask Kevin or me any questions. I guess Kendall's tuned out, but like, yeah, I'll send him the recording of this. But this was great talking to you again. Let me move on and thank you over here. Yes, yeah. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah, my pleasure.
being on the show, and I will reach back to you on this.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. Arjun, it was a pleasure joining you today.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. Have a good one. Bye bye.
See ya.